Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Friday weekly Lunch and Learn. Every Friday at noon, Sierra Club Iowa chapter goes live to give you an environmental update. And today we have our chapter director, Pam Mackey Taylor, who's going to be talking about some water woes in Linn County. We hear a lot about what's happening in Des Moines and the nitrates and the nitrate removal systems and everything, but it does happen all across the state. So today we're going to highlight what's going on in the eastern part of Iowa and the Linn County area. So I'll share my screen and hand it over to Pam. And thank you very much, Pam.
Thank you, Jess. So Linn County is in an area in eastern Iowa where there's going to be a lot of issues in water. And I'd like to point out the picture on this screen. And this is of the Cedar River, which runs through Cedar Rapids and through Linn County. And it's at a time when the water levels were low, and you can notice the sandbar in the middle of the Cedar River. This was taken at Palisades Kepler State Park. Now, the next slide, we'll talk about why we've got a cause for alarm in Linn County. The use of water by industries is expected to explode in the coming years. 10 data centers are either being built or proposed by Google and QTS near the Cedar Rapids Airport. So this would be on the south side of Cedar Rapids. 6 data centers are being proposed by Google near Palo, which is north of Cedar Rapids, also along the Cedar River. 2 gas plants are proposed, one in Cedar Rapids itself, and one on Highway 30 at the Linn County line with Benton County. And the restarted Duane Arnold nuclear plant is also going to be a large water user in the Linn County area. Cedar Rapids recently opened bids for a well to store water in the Jordan Aquifer to use during peak water demand. And finally, the Jordan aquifers are low. Jordan aquifer levels are lowering, particularly in Linn, Johnson, and Webster counties. And in those counties, the aquifer is flagged as a protected water source area. Now, I'd like to talk about peak demand before we go off of this slide. Peak demand happens at the point that the users in the Cedar Rapids Water District are using the most water that they ever use. So that would be the peak, it would be the high. Now, I'd also like to point out on this screen the slide of the Cedar River. And again, it's at a low time, and you can see the sandbars in the middle of the river. So let's go to the next slide. The Jordan Aquifer is at risk. And in 2007, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources issued a water plan they called the Management Strategy for Iowa's Water Resources. And they talked about the Jordan Aquifer, and they said, the Jordan Aquifer is one of 2 aquifers identified in Iowa DNR rules as an aquifer to monitor to prevent excessive water level declines. It has a high potential for groundwater mining, but a relatively low recharge rate. This low recharge rate results in relatively old water in this aquifer, causing the sustainability of this aquifer for the long term to be unknown. In addition, there has been a considerable shift in the demand upon the aquifer over the last 20 years as far as geographical location of pumping centers. The usage area of this aquifer covers over 2/3 of the state of Iowa, and the Jordan is the most reliable aquifer for high-capacity wells. Approximately 14% of Iowans drink water from this aquifer. Now let's talk about the picture on the right side of this slide. This picture is the Cedar River, again at low levels of the Cedar, and it's south of Palo, north of Cedar Rapids, at the Chain Lakes Natural Area. And you can see the sandbars up at the upper portion of it, but also on the left side near the river's edge. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the aquifer some more. The aquifer levels are lowering. As I mentioned earlier, the aquifer in Linn, Johnson, and Webster counties is considered a protected water source area, and Johnson County is just south of Linn County. The DNR is issuing water withdrawal permits for Jordan Aquifer users for 5 years, unlike the 10-year permits for other withdrawals across the state. And there are also restrictions on the water withdrawal amounts, the rates, and it's limiting it to 2,000 gallons per minute for industrial and power users. And so the DNR recognizes there are issues with the Jordan Aquifer. Now, the picture on this slide is the Cedar River at Palisades Kepler, and the sandbars are covered because the water is close to flood stage at this point. And so the water levels vary quite a bit between winter and spring, and then what happens in the summer and fall. On the next slide, we're going to talk about aquifer storage and recovery. Now, the city of Cedar Rapids is pursuing bids for ASR. And what this does is it creates a well into the Jordan Aquifer, and the city would pump water into the aquifer during times of high levels of the Cedar River. And then they would pump water out of that storage area when they need to meet peak demand. In other words, when their other wells are not sufficient to provide water that the citizens and the industries in Iowa need. They would also use this water in blending with water withdrawn for other wells if they have high levels of contaminants, such as nitrates. Cedar Rapids does not have a nitrate removal system like they have in Des Moines, and so they're going to have to rely on blending water that doesn't have nitrates with the water coming out of their wells if it's contaminated with high levels. Now, aquifer storage and recovery is used in areas that have dry climates. Arizona, California, Oregon. Florida also uses some aquifer storage and recovery. There are a few places in Iowa that utilize the aquifer storage recovery mechanisms. One is North Liberty, that's just south of Cedar Rapids. Ankeny, Des Moines, and Urbandale also use ASR. And the Ankeny, Des Moines, and Urbandale is an area that's dealing with high nitrates. They're also dealing with a lot of data centers. So let's talk about where the city of Cedar Rapids gets its water. The city obtains its drinking water supplies from shallow, vertical, and collector wells constructed in the sand and gravel deposits along the Cedar River. Those deposits form an underground water-bearing layer called an alluvial aquifer. Because of continuous pumping of the city's wells, most of the water in the aquifer is pulled from the river. The rest of the water is supplied as water percolates up from a deeper bedrock aquifer or down from the top of the ground. In other words, rain falling on the soil. Now, the key point of this is most of the water in the aquifer is pulled from the river. So if the river levels start falling and falling significantly, the ability for the aquifer to refresh itself is going to be extremely limited. And if you look at the photo on the right, this is also at Chain Lake's natural area, south of Palo, north of Cedar Rapids. And you can see the sandbar on the right. Those sandbars are not visible when the water levels are higher. On the next slide, let's talk about the data centers coming into Linn County. The Linn County Planning Department worked on an ordinance for data centers, and the supervisors passed it. One of the ordinance requirements was for the data center to provide a study of the water sources and the capacity of the source to provide the water. And the ordinance also would require the data center to enter into a water use agreement. Now, this ordinance was for any data center, but it was really focused on the Google data centers because those data centers near Palo were going to be in rural Linn County. On the next slide, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Now, there were discussions of Google having to pay $500,000 for the study, for the water withdrawal capacity study. And the reason why this is significant is that Google was planning to withdraw 14 million gallons of water a day from the Cedar River. Duane Arnold, the nuclear power plant, is going to come online if they're permitted to, and their water withdrawal is 14 million gallons a year. In other words, these Google data centers are going to be using 365 times the amount of water that Duane Arnold uses, the nuclear power plant. So we're talking about a significant withdrawal of water out of the Cedar River. And let's go on to the next slide. Now, Google didn't like the requirements being placed on it by Linn County. So they approached the city of Palo to be annexed into the city. And Palo has been writing a data center ordinance, which passed the first reading by the Palo City Council. There will be no requirement for a water study, no requirement for a water use agreement, and the ordinance depends on and expects the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to do an analysis of the water use and capacity when a permit is issued. But there's a catch. The DNR does not do a water study when it issues a permit. And Google said they're not going to pay for a water study as contemplated by the Linn County ordinance. Now, on the next slide, the DNR is not expected to step in. And the Iowa legislature earlier this year rejected a bill that would require the DNR to individually review each water withdrawal request to determine if there's capacity of the water body to sustain the water withdrawal. This bill passed the House and was blocked in the Senate this year. So let's go on to the next slide. The Cedar River levels are low during the summer. And during the summer, the river exposes sandbars and channels. And if you look at the photo on the right, this again is at Chain Lake's natural area south of Palo, where you can see sandbars approaching from both sides, both banks, and the river flow being narrowed to just the center part. The Cedar Rapids city wells are at risk when the water levels become low, and the towns and residents downstream from Palo at risk. And so this would be northeastern Johnson County, Cedar County, Muscatine County, and Louisa County. On the next slide, Palo residents are worried. They expressed this at the planning and zoning meeting, and they also expressed it to the council last week. Cedar Rapids residents are worried, rightfully so. And so are Linn County residents worried. The legislators need to step up to the plate and pass meaningful legislation that would ensure Iowa's water resources can sustain the withdrawals today and into the future. They need to fund aquifer studies by the Iowa Geological Survey so we have a better feel for how much water we have in our aquifers and how much water can be sustainably withdrawn from the aquifer. The DNR and the legislators need to have restrictions on data center water usage. And the legislators need to make sure that the Department of Natural Resources does its job in reviewing water withdrawal permits and the ability of the water source to sustain the withdrawal. We're in an election season right now, and it's good to talk to the candidates about these issues. And if you happen to be in Palo, on Monday, the City Council will be meeting again. Monday the 22nd, we'll be meeting again. and it makes sense for you to go into Palo, attend the meeting, talk to your council members, and let the Palo Council know that they need to step back with their ordinance and do a little bit more thinking about long-term water use or water withdrawal. And with that, I'll answer questions.
Thank you very much, Pam. Can you talk a little bit more about why the Google plant decided to switch from Linn County to Palo?
So it was very obvious that the Google data centers did not want to comply with the Linn County ordinance. Palo is about 1,400 to 1,700 people living in the city. They clearly don't have the staffing and the support that the planning department has in Linn County. And it appears that Google didn't want to comply with any kind of water studies. So it's just a matter of getting where they can be to get less regulation and less enforcement on what they're wanting to do.
We have one other question. It looks like, what impacts could 14 million gallons a day of water have on the river?
Significant impacts. And that's why we need a water study to determine that. The water flows, as you can tell by those pictures, are such that and the water levels are decreased, water flows are decreased. And so you start taking millions of gallons out of that water stream every single day during a time of drought, when we're not getting much rain, when the flows of the river aren't being restored. It could be significant. And that's why people are extremely worried.
Like you said, and rightfully so. Well, thank you very much, Pam, for sharing this information. And yeah, please get involved, especially if you're in that Palo Linn County area. And then talk to your legislators, no matter where you live in the state, because they're the ones that can make sure that we have those strong protections. So thank you. And we will see you next Friday at noon for the next Lunch and Learn. Have a great day. Bye.